Hello, let me reset the screen first because I was just experimenting with something. Um, so this recording is kind of supplemental material to help you understand some of the concepts that is quite important to do the lab, but I might have made some assumptions incorrectly that this is already known. So let's go ahead and get into those concepts. So I'm gonna get into Node in an interactive mode. This is very helpful because if you just want to test out a few things, there's no need to use an editor and actually use run Node in the more classical way. So you can just use this to interactively evaluate some expressions and find out what's going to happen when you evaluate those expressions. The first thing is I want to create three variables. Okay, so we'll have say x, we'll have y, and to get rid of the autocomplete, see how it is auto-completing and say yield, you can just put a space after y, then it will automatically get rid of the suggested auto-completion. And we'll have a z as well, and once again we have to put a space after that to make sure that the variable name is just z and not zlib. There we go. So now we have three variables. Now every single variable, when you declare, when you use let, it starts with a value of undefined. So undefined is a very kind of special value because it is its own type, and I'll explain that in just a little bit, okay? But I want you to be aware of the fact that anything that has not come into existence yet has by default a value of undefined, okay? So now we can do a few things. We can say, let's make x equal to 6. We'll make y equal to 2, and then we'll make z equal to 5. Okay. So the first thing I want to explain is a ternary expression. A ternary expression means it has three parts to it. Most expressions like x times y has two parts. It has x and y, but those are the only two parts. A ternary expression has three parts to it. The first part is a condition, and if that condition is true, then the second part is returned as a value of the entire ternary expression. If the first part is false, then the third part is returned as the actual value of the entire expression. And the second one is not even evaluated in that case. So let me illustrate what I mean by that. So now I can say, does x equal to 6? Okay, and I'm using equal here. There's also equal. Okay, so those two are slightly different, even though in most cases they can be used interchangeably. There are certain situations where you definitely want to use one but not the other. And I'll explain that later. But for the most part, we can use equal to check for equality or equivalency of values. So if x is 6, and you can see how it is automatically answer the question as soon as it can recognize the expression. So the answer is yes in this case. So now we use a question mark to separate the first part from the second part of a ternary expression. So in this case, the second part is just y, and then the third part is z. And you can see how in Node interactively, it already recognized that this is a legitimate expression, is a ternary expression, and it's already given us the answer of 2, and that's because x equals to y is in fact true, and if the first part is true, it is using the second part as the value of the entire expression. And in this case, it doesn't even bother to evaluate the third one. Alright, so we'll press the enter key. Now it is just printing 2 as the value of this ternary expression. So now we're going to use the same expression, except this time we say, what if the condition says if x does not equal to 6? So in that case, because since x does have a value of 6, so x does not equal to 6 is false. So if the first part is false, then it will skip the second part and evaluate the third part, which is just z in this case, and then return the value of the third part as the value of the entire ternary expression. So if I press the enter key, it just returns a value of 5. All right. So that's a ternary expression. Now, why do we want to bother to understand a ternary expression? It is because Node, okay, JavaScript is not a strongly typed language. Now, but that term probably has very little meaning to you, but that's okay, okay? Because what I'm going to do is to show you why that is called, a not strongly typed language. So typically in a ternary expression, the first part needs to be a condition, which means it is an expression that returns either true or false. But in Node and in some other, most scripting languages, the requirement is not so strict. Okay, so I'm going to show you one thing here, and I can use a 0 and say, y, z. And you can see that, it returns a 5 because 5 is the value of z, which is the else portion. Okay, we evaluate and return the value of z if and only if the first part is false. But 0 is not false, right? Surely 0 is not false. Well, it is equivalent to false. So this is where the triple equal symbol, can make a difference. Okay. So I'm going to use 0, 0 equals false first, and the answer is true. Okay, because they are equivalent to each other. However, if I ask whether 0 is exactly the same as false, which is the job of a triple equal symbol, the answer is no. Well, that's because the types are different. 0 has a type of a numerical value, and then false has a type of Boolean. Now, what is the difference? Well, one you can use in addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and everything else that has to work with numerical values, and that includes sine, cosine, tangent, exponent, log, and so on. The other one, on the other hand, is a Boolean value. A Boolean value can only be used when you're using Boolean operators like and or not. So that's why the types are different. However, if I ask JavaScript and say, can I look at 0 as if it is false? The answer is true, because because there are a lot of situations where okay, I have to admit, this has to do with a lot of programmers are lazy. Okay, so instead of evaluating an expression that guarantees to return a value of Boolean, sometimes they just evaluate to the point where it is a 0 and then rely on the programming language to say, oh yeah, in this context I can look at the 0 as a false, which is sometimes very, very wrong. Okay, and that's why we need to understand why 0 can be evaluated and say it is equivalent to false. However, it is not exactly the same. Okay. All right. So, given this, okay, what else can be interpreted as false? Okay. In other words, we're trying to look into the context of where a Boolean value is expected, but instead of giving it just a Boolean value, if we give it this particular value, can it still be considered as false? So at this point, I'm going to change y and z. Just so that it is more clear about what we are dealing with here. So I'm going to use 0 again, except this time y is a string to tell us considered as true, and then the else portion is considered as false. So this way it is very, very clear that what we are dealing with here. So 0 is considered as false. Okay, very good. And then we'll try something that's much more trivial, which is false itself, right? False is considered as false. No surprises there, right? So now we're going to try it with something a little bit different. Instead of a 0, we'll give it an empty string. Okay, now an empty string in this case can be double quote and then double quote with nothing in between. Can also be single quote and then single quote with nothing in between. But it can also be back quote and then back quote with nothing in between. So it doesn't really matter how you quote the string in this case because there's nothing inside. So we press the enter key and say, hey, that can also be considered as false. Okay, so these three we kind of know because one is a numerical value, one is a Boolean value, the other one is a text value, but there's nothing inside the text. So we kind of think about this and go like, yeah, we can kind of see how, in the context of when a Boolean is expected, the empty string can be considered as false. So we are going to give it two more things, okay? And I need to bring these up because, they do pop up occasionally in scripting. So we're going to say undefined this time. So we're going to use oh wait, I can do better than that. Oh, it doesn't let me repeat the previous string. Okay, that's fine. So we'll have undefined question mark considered as true and then considered as false. There we go. And undefined is considered as false. Okay, and then there's one more. Okay, there's one more magical value that is considered as false. It's called null. So null is okay. Let me see if I can. Oh man, it cannot. I could not use up arrow key to repeat the previous command. I think as soon as I started typing, it wiped out the expression from before. Okay, but that's okay. It's not that bad to have to retype it. So null is considered as false too. So we have these 5 values that are considered as false. Okay, so when you put something into a situation such as a conditional statement, the condition of a conditional statement, you kind of have to think very carefully, okay? Because are you giving the condition a string, in which case it is node the job of node or JavaScript to interpret an empty string as false and non-empty string as true. Or are you giving it something that actually is a Boolean, or are you giving it something that is numerical, in which case node will have to interpret the value of 0 as false and anything other than 0 as true? Or are you giving it something that can be potentially undefined? Okay? Or are you giving it something that can be potentially a null? So you kind of have to keep that in mind. Okay? Now, if you want to avoid this confusion entirely, okay, and just say that whenever I specify a condition, which is an expression that returns a Boolean value, you can always get around this problem by using equal, equal, equal. And I said triple equal. Yes, that's what I said, triple equal. Because if you use double equal, there are certain cases where double equal does make sense. Okay, then let me give you a reason why sometimes a double equal makes sense. When you're dealing with a get parameter, okay, which shows up as a member of query, inside the request object that is usually named as REQ when you're writing an endpoint handler, those items are usually in the form of a string. Okay, and I can show you, just that in just a little bit. Okay, so how do I compare a string to a numerical value? That becomes the next question. Is if everything is coming back to me as strings, then how do I compare it to a numerical value? So that is an interesting question, because if you ask, okay, let me give you an example here. This is 123 without the use of quotes, so it is a numerical value of 123. So if I ask, is the numerical value of 123 considered to be equivalent to the string of just 123? The answer is yes. Okay? And that's because we are using the double equal operator, where we are asking node and say, can you do something on your end so that we can see that these two things are actually the same thing? So based on a lot of assumptions, okay, based on the assumption that 123 in a string is actually in base 10, because okay, this is another discussion in a computer science or programming class that is probably not known in this class. But there are different ways to represent what we know as 123 as a value. So we are using that assumption, and using that assumption, node is using that assumption, then we can say, yeah, these two things are the same. But if you give it a slightly different thing, which is this, it will still be considered the same. So node is really trying its best to say, okay, let me see how I can look at these two things as the same thing. If I can, I'll tell you true. If I cannot, then I'll tell you false. But this becomes it becomes really useful, because if you're if your JavaScript or if your Node.js program, okay, those two are slightly different, but they are actually the same in terms of what the language portion is the same, but how they're used are different. But if you're looking at the case of a query parameter, okay, which is entered by a question mark followed by the name of the parameter equals to the value of the parameter in a URL, I'll show you that exactly what I mean later on. So if you're thinking about that, everything comes back as strings. Okay, if you look at all the values that you're storing within a session, everything comes back as a string. So what that means is now you're dealing with a bunch of strings. But what if you actually want to compare the string to a numerical value, like the 6-digit passcode? That's usually stored as a numerical value. But it's converted into a string as soon as we store it into a session. So there are those questions. But okay, let me get back to the equal versus the triple equal. So if I ask whether 123 is exactly the same as the string of 123, the answer is false because they have different types. So once again, the type makes a difference because 123 over here, without the quotes, is a numerical value. We can use multiplication, we can use division, and so on. But on this side, it is a string type, which means it is text information. So now the question is, can I tell what kind of a value something is? Okay, so we're going to go back to x here, and this time we'll change x to, let's keep x first. Okay, so we'll look at x. X has a value of 6, which is a numerical value. Every time you see something without being quoted inside this environment, it is a numerical value. So 6 is a numerical value. There's an operator, okay, called type of. And this is going to be helpful because if I ask what is the type of x, it tells us it is a number, and this is a string. It is returning a string indicating that whatever x is a number. Okay, so what if I make y to be the string with 6 in it? Okay, so y is basically text information. So this time, if I ask whether x and y can be considered the same, the answer is yes. So we talked about that, earlier, using these examples. But if we ask what is the type of y, the answer is it is a string. Okay, so this is really kind of important. Okay, another item that you will find really useful is how do we check whether something is a member of an object, and what if it is not? Okay, so we're gonna now make a new thing. We'll say let obj be an object, and every object starts, if you want to define an object literally, you start with open brace and then you specify the members inside the object. In this case, we will say, this particular object has a member A, which has a value of 23. It has a member called B. It has a value of a string, which is ABC. And that's it. Okay, so it has 2 members. So now when we ask what is obj, as a variable, its value is an object, and it has member A is 23, and then it has member B being the string of ABC. Okay, fantastic. Now we can say, okay, give me member A of obj, it's 23. Give me member B of obj, it is the string of ABC. Now we ask, what about C, which doesn't exist, right? Member C does not exist in this particular object with a name of obj. So what if we ask that question? So interestingly, okay, because when I type C, it auto completes as constructor. So I'm going to put a space here, and so that it's not auto completing. And as you can see, it is undefined. Oh, so this is a very useful mechanism, isn't it? Because if a member does not exist inside an object, it returns the value of undefined. It does not return a 0, it does not return a false, it does not return an empty string, it returns undefined. Okay, so that's one thing. Second thing, if there's a member inside an object, and I want to make sure it is not an empty string, then what do I do? Okay, for instance, in this case, we have member A and then we have member B, but I want to make sure whatever member I'm checking is not an empty string. So now the question is, well, maybe we should check whether it is a string to begin with, right? Because otherwise it doesn't make sense to ask whether it is an empty string or not, or to confirm that it is a non-empty string, I should say it that way. So if you want to confirm something is in an object, and on top of that it is a string, and on top of that it is not an empty string, there are a few ways you can do this. Okay, so the first thing is you can always look at the type of. Okay, so if you look at type of obj.c, which does not exist, okay, it is undefined. In other words, it doesn't give you an error. Okay, it does not stop the execution of the code and come back with an error and go like, hey, you cannot do this because this member does not exist. No, if you try to access a member that does not exist, it still reports back the type of, but it will report it back as undefined. So that is useful because undefined is not the same as a string. Okay, because in this case, if I ask what is obj.a, it is a number, and if I ask what is obj.b, it is a string. So this is how we can tell not only whether a member exists within an object or not, we can tell what the type is at the same time. So we can try to do a match of, okay, let me back up a little bit. So we can check for existence, confirm the type, and in the one single statement, because all we need to do now is, if I want to make sure that member B is in fact a string, I can just say whether obj.b, and I can use equal in this case to string, because if it is the case, then not only have we just confirmed that member B does exist in the object obj, we also know this member has a type of string. Now, once we know it is a string, then we can see whether it is empty or not. So we can now say, using ampersand, this is how we specify, this is how we say and, A-N-D, in JavaScript and most other programming languages that are based on C and C++. So we use ampersand to say and then the next thing we want to check is to compare obj.b to the empty string. So we now say, well, now that we know obj.b does exist and it is a string, now we want to see whether it is empty or not. So now not equal to is usually typed as exclamation point equal, because exclamation point itself is equivalent to the English word of not, and you usually use it at the beginning of a Boolean expression, but we can use it this way. And now we can ask, is it not the same as an empty string? So this is how we can check both at the same time. We can make sure that member B does exist in obj, it has a type of a string, and on top of that, this string is not empty. This is how we can confirm all of those things in one conjunction. Ampersand, which is and, is also known as conjunction in mathematics. So I think you might find this kind of expression actually useful when you're writing your program. So since we are talking about logic operators, because this is a logical operator, ampersand, we're going to talk about the other two logical operators, even though they may or may not be really that useful for your script for this lab. Okay, the first one is negation. So negation is pretty easy. Not true is false, and then not false is true. So exclamation point as an operator is logical negation. It simply flips the polarity of the Boolean value that is on its right hand side. So that's negation. And then the next one is or, just English word spelled as OR. So we have true or true is true. Then we have true or false is also true. Then we have false or true, which is also true. And then finally we have false or false, and that is finally false. So in the case of a or, known as disjunction for mathematicians, if at least one side is true, the whole thing is going to be true. So the only time it can be false is when both sides of the OR are false. So that's a logical operator OR. Now, since we are presenting, the how a logical operator works, we might as well do this for conjunction as well, because even though we talked about conjunction or the word and earlier, I never really show you, all the different values that you can put on this left hand side and the right hand side. So we're going to do the same thing here. So we have true and true being true. We have true and false being false. And then we have false and true being false. And then we have false and false being false. So you can sort of, I wouldn't say exactly, but you can sort of look at and as the opposite of or, in the sense that in an and, you need both sides to be true in order for the entire expression to be true. If you can find at least one false on either side of the and, then the result is going to be false. All right, so these are the kind of more basic items that I think you might find useful when you are writing the script for the current lab, which is kind of interesting. So I'm going to show you what the script is going to run, what it looks like when we run it. So let's get out of the interactive mode of Node, go to my express.debug. Now it's still in my debug, because quote unquote it's not in production yet. I'm still quote unquote debugging it. So I call this one app, I cannot remember, auth, I think, for authentication. Now you can name your script any way you want, because I can't even see how you name your script. So you can name it any way you want. And when I run this, I can now go to the Power Server and actually give it a try. And I cannot remember where I probably don't have a tab on this particular window at this point, so you cannot see what I'm typing. Let me show you what I'm typing here. There we go. All right, so it's under Express, my username .debug. So when you turn in your homework, don't put it into your sandbox. You have to put it into your production folder, so that the URL does not end with debug. All right, so let's go here. The first step was test session. So it is an endpoint that ends with test session with a slash, and then we press the enter key. Yeah, I have triple S here instead of double. Okay, so let's back off one of those. Okay, so now it starts with 0. And this is a really simple script. If you just refresh it, it should increment the number. And there's one way to reset the session. And the way to reset the session, I didn't really make a button for it, but if you use the question mark here, which means you're trying to specify a get parameter, and then you specify the name of the parameter as reset, and then specify equals to, and then you specify the value of 1, then it will give you it will reset the session. And once you reset the session, because it basically the session that was around is now deleted, and as a result it starts from 0 again. So this part is just trying to make sure that your session part is working, that you know how to reset, quote unquote, reset a session. I'm providing a function to do that. The function is called unset session. It is provided as a part of the lab. So for that part, you just have to copy and paste, and then remember to use await when you call that particular function with a request object. All right, so second thing is at the endpoint of test form 0, okay, which is presenting your form like this. If you are not particularly if you don't want to write your code for a form, I'm going to show you this trick here. It is not cheating, it's just HTML code that you can borrow. Okay, you can actually just borrow my code here. Everything from form and ending at the end tag of form. So you can just copy and paste this portion. Because this portion doesn't really do anything, it's really just defining the form. So you can just copy and paste it if you want. So the behavior of form 0 is not really sophisticated. You just give it a name. Okay, I give it my name. You give it an email address. At this point, it shouldn't do anything, for test form 0. So you can give it, any email address. Okay, it doesn't even have to be legitimate. And then you click submit, and that's it. So test form 0 is just making sure that you get the form done. Okay, and it has, the name, it has the email address, it has a submit button. That's all we need. Then we move on to test form 1. So test form 1 adds a certain amount. Now when you look at the URL, you can definitely tell that because we are using a get method with this form, the information captured by the form is submitted to the server as a part of the URL. So this is where the email address appears as a get parameter. The ampersand here is used to separate multiple parameters. And then the other part, if I just kind of show you this part here. So this part here is telling you that if there's another get parameter called name, and the value is tag space aoyang. So space, there are two ways to escape a space. Backslash percent 20 is one way to escape a space character, but the other one, which is easier, is just the plus symbol, because space is used so often that I guess the standard decides, okay, we'll use a very well-known character as a stand-in for the space character. But that means, if you want to express the actual plus as a part of the answer, as a part of the value of the get parameter, then you have to escape the plus, because a plus is not exactly a plus when it is interpreted by the server. Okay, so that's basically just me kind of yakking along to talk about the get parameters and how it is encoded. It's not very important for the assignment that we have at this point. So now we're going to get into test form 1. So test form 1, when you first get there, it gives you exactly the same thing, right? So we're going to re-enter tag aoyang, and then my email address. Okay, this is my apps.losrios email address, losrios.edu, and then you click submit. And this one does behave slightly differently, because once you submit, it's going to give you this particular screen here. It's the same script, it's the same endpoint handler. So now your endpoint handler needs some logic, right? Because it needs the logic to tell whether something is submitted, whether the email and the name are empty or not. Because if they're empty, you should represent the form. I can show you that too. But if they are non-empty, it is supposed to output something like this, where there's a hyperlink which is reset. And if you look at the bottom of the screen right now, you can see I cannot move my cursor because I need it to be hovering in order to show the URL. But if you look at the URL, it ends with question mark reset equals 1. So that's basically a get parameter that your endpoint handler has to check. If it has a value of 1, then we are going to reset the session. And the mechanism to reset the session was already done using test session. So the test session endpoint is supposed to test the ability to reset a session. So you just have to copy and paste that code into here to reset a session. And then this message here is totally useless. All it's saying is, yeah, I got your name and I got your email, but I'm doing nothing with it because this is not complete yet. Okay, so I'm giving you these steps so that you are writing some code. Okay, possibly with simpler logic and simpler features. Get it to work first, and then we move on to the next one where we add a little bit more, and then we add a little bit more until the whole thing works. Okay. Alright, so we're going to reset the session, and this time I'm going to enter nothing for name and nothing for email. Click submit, and you can see that this time it's just representing exactly the same thing because I just gave it something that's empty. Now, ideally speaking, in the real world, you probably want to give the end user a warning and say name and email cannot be empty or something along that line so that the end user knows how to correct it. But in this program, I'm not putting too much attention on error checking, because if we want to do error checking, we can easily double the size of the program. That's how much code a typical commercial application would put into error checking. And then we also have to understand regular expressions, which is by itself an interesting topic, but it is also something that takes time to learn. Okay, so I don't want to throw that in when our main focus is to talk about sessions and also the query, the get parameters. Now let's gonna test. What if I just give it one of the two? Okay, so I just give it a name but not the email, and it just says, "Hey, give me the other one," because it is required. Okay, both of these fields are required by the form. So I think that's actually stopping it being submitted in the first place, because when I click submit, the client side is interpreting the required attribute of the form element, and it is basically stopping it right here. I do apologize. I might need to check a few things. Nope, I'm good. Thank you. Because my phone just rang and I just need to make sure it's not something that's urgent. Alright, so let's move on to test form 2. So here's test form 2. Press the enter key. It looks exactly the same as test form 1 because the form itself is the same. So now I'm going to enter my name again. And this time it is important to give it an actual email address. Now, whether you want to use the school email address or your private Gmail account doesn't really matter. Okay, you can even use a gateway, an email gateway. Okay, I misspoke. You can even give it a SMS gateway email address, which is basically a way to use the email method to send somebody a text message, a SMS text message. That is possible. Okay, but I'm not gonna do that. I'm just gonna use a regular email address here, and then I click submit. And this time it says a passcode is sent to the email address. Let me bring up my Gmail so that you can see it. Okay, so Gmail. And this is the Gmail corresponding to the account. So I just sent myself a passcode. This message was sent because of that click. So I just sent myself a passcode of 169480. So this is the job of test form 2, is the addition. In addition to what we already have done in test form 1, the addition would be 1 to generate a 6-digit random number, and then 2 to send it by email. Now, where did I talk about sending email using the command line interface? It's in one of the announcements. Okay, so let me see if I still have access to one of those links here from Canvas. Maybe not, so I'm gonna have to sign in again, or not. Yep, okay, I don't have to sign in again. That's good. Alright, so if you check the announcement, there's one announcement here that says something about sending email using the command line interface, and it's right here. So this is an actual command line. If you copy and paste this onto the Power Server command line interface and just press the enter key, it will do it. Okay, it's actually going to send the code of, in this case, 658204 to this particular email address, which is my actual email address, and it will have a subject line of sign-in code instead of passcode. So now the question is, if we know this CLI command, this command line interface command, yeah, I know that sounds kind of odd, but if this CLI command works in the shell inside the user interface, how do we make this work inside a Node script? Okay, that's the question. And fortunately, we have one module dedicated to just that. Okay, we have one module that talks about how to run CLI commands. It's specifically shelled CLI commands inside a Node script. So you might want to reread that one and integrate the code that is in that particular module into your script. Okay, that is how we achieved what I demonstrated a little bit earlier here. So you can reset the session, because if you don't reset the session, even if you refresh the page, it's not going to send you a new code. It will just keep the old code and just keep reminding you that that code has been sent to you already. All right. So now this is the final stage. Okay. So when you're all done, then you end up with auth. Okay. So the endpoint is called auth, and auth is, okay, I misspelled auth. AUTH without the I. There we go. So it looks exactly the same again, but this time, okay, I'm gonna show you what it's gonna do. So once again, I'm gonna give you the email address, click submit, and this time it says reset session, okay, but I don't want to reset it, okay, because I'm trying to authenticate myself. So it would also remind you that passcode has been sent to the email address, but this time it will also give you a very small form where it's asking you about the passcode itself. So once again, if you don't want to figure out how to make this form in HTML, which you should have learned from CISW410, you can always just go to view page source and then locate the code for the form itself, which starts with a form tag like here, and then you can just kind of copy it all the way down to slash form, which is here. So you can always just kind of copy and paste it. Okay, I don't mind, because this is not really the important part of this script. Okay, because it's just a very simple little form here. But now what I need to do is to go to my Gmail, and you can see how I just got a new message, and I show it, and here is the code 916491. Okay, you can always just copy and paste it, by the way. So I'm just going to copy, paste it here. There's no need to use a password field, because this is a one-use kind of thing, right? Once I submit, this passcode is useless after this. So unless somebody can copy and paste it, on a separate device and click submit before I do, well, even that is not going to be helpful, because it doesn't even belong to the same session. So it's pretty safe, okay, not to hide these digits in this case, because nobody can really hijack this session at this point. So I click submit, and guess what? It confirms that I have logged in, and this is actually the name that I entered earlier in the form. It just remember that and then use it in the welcome. Now, the other part that is kind of interesting about this is we are no longer at the auth endpoint. We are back to the root endpoint. All right, so we are now at the root endpoint, which means this session is now authenticated. I have established who is the end user. That's usually identified just by the email address. Now, whether that user has a lot of access to what we're going to do with updating a database or not, that's to be determined. Okay, but at least I understand that this session is now belonging to someone who has authenticated as W0006887 at apps.losrios.edu. That's the one thing that I know, is whoever has authenticated has access to that particular email address. Okay, so that's good. Now, there's one more thing that I need to show you, is we can reset this. So as you can probably imagine, to reset the entire session, we just put a question mark here and then say auth reset equals to 0, equals to 1, sorry, equals to 1, and it cannot be in the root endpoint. This has to be done inside the auth endpoint here. So if you use the auth endpoint and then you specify question mark and then reset equals to 1, let me show the entire URL at the end here. So if you specify this particular URL with the parameter reset to be a 1 and then press the enter key, it will reset the entire thing. So the previous session is now completely gone. And now we can start a new session. Somebody else can sign in, using a different email address, and it will proceed, just like what it did earlier. So this is the finished product of, your script. So obviously, I'm not going to show you the actual JavaScript or the actual Node.js script because that's kind of what I want you guys to do. Um, so I have to kind of add this part here because um, there are different expectations, when it gets to coding. So with some other professors, they will give you a program that's almost done, and then all you have to do is to change a few lines, add a few lines, delete a few lines, and then the work is done. Um, I'm not going to do that. So instead, I'll give you the pieces. I'll give you the step-by-step thing, like this is what your current um, endpoint handler should do, and then I'll give you the extension. So you kind of have to do this step by step. So instead of using in addition, I should say, in addition of using the mechanism of just copying the file to a different name using a different, using a date code so you can back it up, I'm also using, you just copy and paste, okay, an entire function, change the name a little bit, and then you add a little bit more to it. So this way you can maintain one that is still working and it's still going to be working within Node, but at the same time, you can extend the functionality and you have a backup that's in the file already because it's just an earlier function. So test form 0 is the basis of test form 1, test form 1 is the basis of test form 2, and then test form 2 is finally the basis of auth. Okay, so all of those endpoints are related. Now test session is something that you need to incorporate into test form 1, but it's not just a regular copy and paste. It's the mechanism that you need to copy. All right, so I think I have covered most of the things that you need to know in order to get started with this project. So there's one more thing that I just want to demonstrate, and this one, has nothing to do with the auth program. So I'm going to locate and run one that is simpler. Okay, so I'm going to run maybe just app.js. Let me take a look at app.js because I want to illustrate. Nope, this one does not use session. I want one that uses sessions. So app session maybe. Okay, so let's take a look at app session. And in here we have, yep, we definitely have, we make use of session in this particular one. So what I want to illustrate here is, what would be the type of things that we store in the query and also in session itself. So I'm going to keep this window open because I have signed in, using other, shells too. So this one I'm going to change to the same folder, and I'm going to use this one to run, but this time I'm going to run it with the inspect. Okay, so we say inspect equals to localhost and 9320 is my port number, and the program that I want to run is app session. So this is starting, the app itself. But it's also enabling the debugging. I'm going to use the third one to actually use this one as a client to connect to the server that I started earlier with this tab over here. So with this one, I don't even need to change the folder. It doesn't hurt to change the folder to the same folder, but it's not needed. For this one, I just say node, and then we say inspect, and then we specify localhost 9320. Press the enter key, and we should get a confirmation on the other one that says debugger attached, which is good. And now we go back to the editor to find out which line I want to stop in order to take a look at a few things. I don't want to delay the reply coming from the server, so I would just put a breakpoint at the end of the entire subroutine, the entire function, which is on line 77. And that's what I would do. And I'm going to use the command of set breakpoint. The name of the file is appsession.js, and then the line number is 77. Press the enter key, and it confirms we are now putting a breakpoint at the end of the function that we call, oh, I cannot remember the name of the function, but that's not actually important. The important part is we now have a breakpoint. And then what we do is we get back to the browser, not this one, this one over here. Alright, so now we go back to the root endpoint, because this one just goes all the way back to the root endpoint, and it is hung up because it is currently at a breakpoint. Okay. I thought after res.end that it would actually reply, send a reply back. Apparently that is not the case. Okay, it's probably a timing issue. But at this point, what I want to show you is something I need to get into REPL to show, because REPL allows you to do the evaluation. So this is basically back to the same kind of environment where we could interactively test expressions, but you have to enter the REPL environment first. So let's go ahead and check out a few things. So we're going to check out session as a member of REQ. So we say req.session and then press the enter key. It shows us quite a few things, but it shows us weight is a numerical value of 0. So it does keep track of 0 as a numerical value. We also want to check query, and query has nothing in this case. Alright, so we get out of REPL with 2 control C's. So control C, just one control C, I take it back. Just one control C will get us back to the debugger. Now we continue. So the browser should see the reply. And if I give it a parameter, now you can always add parameter even if the script is not expecting any parameter. So I'll give it a parameter that has a name of ABC, which is not what the script is expecting at all, but that's okay. It's not going to complain about it. It simply would just ignore that. And we'll put ABC equals to 1, which is a numerical value. Press the enter key. And then go back to the debugger. Now we are at a breakpoint again. We know we are at a breakpoint because not only do we see line 77 with the highlight of green, but we also see the little greater than symbol here, which means we are now at that breakpoint. So now we get into REPL again, and then we evaluate the same kind of expressions. So we say req.session, and we can see how weight is now 1 because it was incremented from before. But we can also check out req.query, which now has a string of 1. So this is where things get tricky, because when you pass something using a get parameter, it is reported back as a string. But when you try to store something into a session, sometimes it's a string and other times it is a numerical value. So if you want to see if they are the same, triple equal is not going to work, because if I say req.session.weight triple equal to req.query.abc, it comes back as false. On the other hand, if I use double equal, which is asking Node to say, hey, can you look at these two things as the same thing? Do some work on your side and see if you can come back with an answer of whether they are equivalent or not. The answer is yes. So this is why it is important to differentiate between the use of the triple equal versus the double equal. And I can now get out of REPL, Control C, and then do a continue, which is just C by itself. Press the enter key. So the browser would now continue, and now we have a wait of 1 second, which is expected. So that's it. Okay, so this is this is the last portion of today's demonstration, is to show you how to use the debugger to get to things that we have stored in the session, and also things that we have specified in the query. Because if your script doesn't work, okay, which is more likely than not, it's not going to work the first time. Okay, nothing works for me the first time. So if it doesn't work for you the first time, the question is, how do you debug your script? The debugger or the inspector is a great tool to do that, because it allows you to examine what is in the session right now, what is in the query right now. With a complex conditional statement, what are we, how are we proceeding through those branches? Okay, so I lied. I said this would be the end, but I want to illustrate that portion too. So that portion has to do with the flow of the conditional statement, which started all the way on this line, which is line 29. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a breakpoint on line 29 too. So we'll do a SB, and then the name of the file is app session.js, and then we want to set a breakpoint on line 29. Press the enter key, double confirm that this is the place where we want to put a breakpoint. So now I'm going to go back to the browser, which is over here, and we'll refresh. And as soon as we refresh, we will hit a breakpoint, and this time it's not going to be the other endpoint. It's not the other breakpoint. It's not at the end of the function. This one is at the very beginning of the function. So at this point, we can do a bunch of stuff. Okay, we can do a REPL just to make sure that whether the request has a session or not. So we ask request.session. What is it? It's at least it's not undefined. It's not false. It is here. Okay, so that's good. We get out of REPL, and instead of using continue, which executes the program at full speed, we want to use either step that can potentially step into something, or we can use the other one, which is, I cannot remember. Step is one, and next is the other one. So we're going to use next instead of step here. So next is just n. So now we are going into the if statement on line 34. And if I do another next, so now we want to see if this condition evaluates to true or not. So one thing you can really easily do is to get into REPL, REPL. And if you know how to copy and paste from Putty, this would be helpful because you just select the text and then you just copy it over here. I think it's just the middle button on your mouse that can, in Putty it's the right click, sorry. So right click will paste whatever you have selected on in Putty. So now you can see, oh, this is false. So that means we are supposed to go to the else branch next. So Control C to get out of REPL first, and then you type N for next. So now we continue with the else corresponding to that condition. So this way you can step by step just like if you just press the enter key, it's the same thing as pressing N and then the enter key. It's basically a shorthand, so you don't have to keep pressing the N key. So we can now, that was a delay, so you could probably tell there's a delay between me pressing the enter key here and displaying this stuff here, and that's because we have a wait of a delay function, and now we increment the wait member of the session. So if I just press the enter key, it just keep going. It's the same thing as typing N and then the enter key. So at this point, we are getting back to the outputting of the HTML document, where we can just do a continue. It hits the very last breakpoint of the entire function, which is actually not needed at this point, but I'm just going to press another C. So now if you go back to the browser, it replies back and say the next refresh will take 2 seconds. So this is how I would debug a program, is to use the inspector as much as possible so that I can set up breakpoints first to find out whether we get to a certain line or not. 2, if we do get to that certain line, I have a chance to look at the values of things. Okay, usually we are looking at the member of something in the request object, but at least we have a way to do it. So those are the clues of how these are the things that I think will help you get this program done. So as I said, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. And the best way to contact me is on Discord, but if you don't want to use Discord, you can always use the alternative methods. All right, so get started on this one early, and and if you get into questions about the concepts, about how to proceed at a certain point when you're stuck, just let me know, and I will try to help you. I'll try to help you fix the problem yourself. I'll put it that way. All right, so that's it for today's recording.